would you say your life means to you?
That means adventure. It means commitment to various things that I care about. It means fun. I've had a very it means luck. A lot of lucky things happening to me. And that means longevity, of course, for me. I'm kind of surprised to find myself this so old.
Did you accomplish everything you ever wanted to?
Well, you never do, I suppose. But I didn't go about life that way. I more or less took the opportunities as they came along. I did at one time think I would like to be a foreign correspondent. But in those days, you didn't have a career and a family. And I was much more in love at that time, so I opted for a family, for a husband, getting married, and then life was very fulfilling in the sense I did become a foreign correspondent. So I thought that would be a nice, adventurous life to live.
I was born on the 14th of April in 1918, 2 years before women got the right to vote, and I was called Miriam, a good biblical name for a Methodist. My brother Douglas was only 20 months older than me, and I later sensed my mother had not intended to have a second child so soon. I was to be the last. We lived in an apartment on Vine Street in Hartford, Connecticut in that April of 1918, but soon moved to Windsor, the next town north. The trolley tracks by my house were a continual source of wonder and excitement, with its clanging bells, its grinding hum, starting low and escalating to a high pitch as it swayed away along the tracks. My father, John Lee Brooks, was born and raised in Camden, New Jersey. He ran away from home with his mother's help. However, my mother, Genevieve Marie Ford, was surrounded by family. I liked and admired my family throughout my childhood years. The Great Depression. There is nothing more corrosive of the spirit than an obsession with money, or the lack of it.
The west, girdling the continent, a lush and a lusty land. Yet even then the signs were present, the ominous whispers. If you look beyond the fields, poverty, like a cancer, malignant. And beyond the facade of the skyline, swept under the city's rug, teeming millions, never more than a copper coin from starvation. As the decade of the 20s neared its end, the great democracy of the West, the brave new world, became aware of strange twitchings and pains.
I earned a respectable amount of money quarter by quarter. I did a lot of babysitting and even got a steady job, taking a blind neighbor for an hour's walk every afternoon after school. In spite of some struggles, our family survived the Great Depression almost unscathed. We never stood in a bread line or ate at a soup kitchen, as did so many. In the fall of 1931, at the depth of the Depression, I started freshman year at Chaffey. As far as I know, I'm the only girl who took, or who was given the chance to take, 5 years to go through Chaffey. I don't remember more than a momentary feeling of disgrace at repeating 10th grade. I didn't go to college to find a man. Connecticut College for Women was on an isolated hilltop in New London. However, the closeness Bud and I felt during the summer of 1934 turned out to be the real thing, not just a momentary summer romantic fling. For you who want to keep a good relationship going, I recommend Bud's methods, especially if you have some writing and artistic talents, in which I married him later in 1940. Since Connecticut College was comparatively small and intimate, a good many of us were given the responsibility for running it. I soon found myself choosing courses on the basis of those who taught them, rather than the subject matter. That must have been why I majored in German. Since there weren't many of us who majored in that subject, it seemed natural for Miss Hafkesbrink, the head of the department, to stop me in the hall one day in the winter of 1938 to offer me a scholarship for the summer session at the University of Heidelberg. I hesitated only long enough to think about how to finance such an adventure. The bursar's office told me the Groton Grange wanted to lend a college student $50 for further education, and if I would join the Grange, I could qualify. Could I live on $50 for 3 months in Germany? I thought so. My answer to Miss Hafkesbrink was yes. Yes, of course. I kept a diary of this momentous summer. On the later evening of June 10, 1938, I stood on the dock of the steamship St. Louis of the Hamburg American Line, waving goodbye to my family as we pulled out of the New York harbor on our way to Germany. Now on to my diary, which I pretended was made up of letters to my best friend Lee. Not knowing who might read it, I was careful not to write anything that might get someone, me, in trouble. My decision to take off alone for months to a country going through frightening developments, I couldn't help but wonder what I or my family really knew about what I was getting myself into. The first thing I noticed was that everyone was wearing a uniform, even young girls and boys, of all ages being in a high state of excitement. As you can see, every day was full of excitement and feelings of exhilaration, anticipation, and loneliness. My trip from Z to Heidelberg took me through more glorious woods. In one little town, I heard much shooting and saw terrific war tanks whizzing around the corner at me. Over in a field where many soldiers were drilling, some airplanes buzzed around after each other overhead. It was all so realistic, and yet I think the soldiers and the youth in general think of it as all a huge game. They were assured they were superior to the rest of the world, would take over the world and cover themselves and Germany with glory. Peace was not in their vocabulary. July 9th, 1938. Classes at the university begin. Our first lecturer, it was just what one would expect from a talk on German history from a high Nazi official, followed by a gas mask drill and a student demonstration. What have these 3 months meant to me? I learned something about myself. I found I enjoyed my own company, that being alone wasn't all that dreadful. I also learned I could survive unhappiness, especially if it wouldn't last forever. In fact, I found life could be pretty exciting and interesting, even when desperately lonely. But what else? The most disturbing things I saw this summer were the signs that the war was being planned by the Nazis, using every insidious method guile could devise. By sowing hatred against Jews and Poles and other vulnerable groups, by pounding Aryan and folklore myths into German people from an early age, instilling in them a willingness to sacrifice for the glory of the fatherland, and giving them a belief they were superior and worth more than everyone else in the world. I realized we would need to speak out immediately, support whoever was being scapegoated, and defend all points of view, whether we liked them or not. Well, having answered any worries I had about my own country to immense relief, I watched from the deck in the dusk of September 14th as we sailed slowly into the New York harbor, and saw that great lady, the Statue of Liberty, emerge through the mist. My heart leapt up with as much excitement as any immigrant's. I had made it home. A more significant storm I had avoided by leaving Germany when I did was Kristallnacht, the night of the shattered glass. On November 9th, 2 months after I left, using the excuse of the murder of a German diplomat in Paris by a 17-year-old Polish Jew, the Nazis smashed the windows of Jewish-owned establishments, vandalized synagogues, homes, schools, and graveyards, and damaged about 7,500 businesses. After years of gathering storm, the clouds had burst.
I began my professional career as a teacher and later became active in many different political movements. Bud and I eventually started a family. Mike was a great first child, interested in everything, and the teachers reveled. Tim was mischievous, had curly red hair, and a big appetite. He grew very quickly, and too soon he was crowding Mike's rightful place as firstborn. The third time around, giving birth to Dan in May of 1946 and caring for him was easy enough, and he had to have been our last. Nonetheless, our fourth child did turn out to be Kate, a girl Bud said I was hoping for, and she evoked some unusual reactions in all of us.
The symbols and the leaders change, but Germany's maniacal urge to impose its will on others continues from generation to generation. In the last 75 years, this madness has cost the world more than 20 million killed, more than 60 million wounded, more than 200 million made homeless. This does not include the untold millions that died of disease resulting from war, or the billions upon billions of dollars worth of property destroyed. Nor does this include the grief.
The summer before Dan was born, the devastating Second World War ended. Germany surrendered in May 1945, and the war in the Pacific was obviously coming to an end. I volunteered to head up the League of Women Voters, studying civil liberties. We asked 6 of our friends of different sections of town to host a series of neighborhood meetings to discuss the League's publications produced for the Freedom Agenda. The 1950s contained many hardships and travel. The summers, my children said, they were saved by our trips to Squam Lake in New Hampshire. On June 12, 1955, we flew in a prop plane from New York to Manchester, England for 15 months of wandering. Our children were great traveling companions, full of curiosity and inventing lots of ways to make our journeys fun. Coming home, and when everyone went off to school, I was free to take in something new. What I wanted most with that time was to understand more history. We'd been surrounded all year by glimpses of momentous events, both past and current. I wanted to know a great deal more, so I enrolled in 2 courses at Wesleyan University, the start of my master's degree, and maybe my teaching career. I was granted a Master's of Arts degree in 1959 in the first class which Wesleyan allowed women graduate degrees in areas other than education. The decade of the 50s is stamped with my memory because of a personal sorrow. My mother died suddenly of a brain aneurysm in May of 1957 at the young age of 64. My mother treated me as an equal, and I lost a friend when she died, as well as the parent I was most entwined with. My father was a vivacious 74-year-old without an anchor. So we persuaded him to join me at Wesleyan, where he could take enough courses one at a time to make up the credits to graduate. However, we were no substitute for his loss, and he died of pneumonia, the old man's friend, 12 years after Mother at the age of 87. The 1960s was a defining decade of the century for me as well as our country. How can anyone convey the emotional havoc of those times to the generation which didn't live through them? There was confidence that our democracy was getting stronger, that together we could rectify the injustices of segregation through the civil rights movement. Yet by the end of the decade, there were growing cynicism and despair, and the realization that men making decisions for us were just old, fallible, and even immoral. Some early clouds on the horizon should have warned us of the coming storm. In the fall of 1962, Bud and I participated in one more project initiated by the League of Women Voters. We were part of a suit, Butterworth et al. Versus Dempsey et al., brought by 10 of us against Connecticut's governing officers on the grounds of the denial of equal protection of the law by reason of the inequities in representation in both houses of the General Assembly. The outcome wasn't exactly what we had anticipated. The suburbs seemed to garner more political power than the cities, but the control and resistance to change in the agricultural-oriented conservative smaller towns was broken.
This case fit well with my U.S. history courses at Chaffey. Teaching is a great way to educate the teacher. So history is alive after all. That was the last action I took with the League.
In the fall of 1962, our government decided the Soviets were installing nuclear missiles in Cuba.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island.
The nearness of nuclear war shook us all. How secure was future based on threats and obvious violations of international law? To our great shock and sorrow, it was Kennedy who was assassinated, not Castro. It was the school-aged children who were deeply troubled by this close call.
At the request of the Office of Civil and Defense Mobilization, the United States Army Chemical Corps has developed a mask especially for civilian use. This mask protects the wearer against biological and chemical attack by purifying the air inhaled. Masks are worn wherever the air may be impure, by firemen in smoke-filled buildings, by farmers spraying crops, by painters, miners, and many others.
They were the ones who participated getting under desks, protecting them against nuclear attacks. But the smart ones knew desks were not adequate shelter against the bomb. Dan remembers a biology class when in the middle of a long explanation, one of the girls asked, "Why should we learn all about this when we are going to die soon anyway?" Dan says the teacher answered, "We have to pretend we're going to live and continue to do our work." The civil rights movement comes to Connecticut. Anyone with half an ear to the political ground can hear the rumblings of the rebellion against racial segregation and our country's pervasive discrimination against people of color. None of our family went south to help out, but we too were a modest part of the civil rights movement. In the fall of 1964, we added Anna Bing from Beaufort, South Carolina, to our household. She and we were part of the Quaker program called the Southern Student Program, a program that recruited Northern families to host good Southern students from segregated Southern schools for their junior and senior years of high school.
While we watched, the white children went to school, and we stood outside.
The aim was to prepare competent blacks for better colleges, jobs, and better lives, a very small-scale attempt to achieve equal opportunity. Anna was bright, knew how to study, had usually been top of her class, and was unexpectedly self-possessed.
Anna graduated from Conard High School and was offered a full scholarship to Oberlin.
When Anna's father died, she left the summer program after 5 weeks and never went back. She met an old school friend and later married. "Aren't you disappointed?" many friends asked. We didn't worry. A few years later, she wrote from Germany that she and her husband were returning back to the States. They both earned bachelor's and master's degrees and were settling in Anchorage, Alaska. Some of the most effective teaching I did in those years was not in Connecticut, but in Washington, D.C. Every spring, I took my U.S. history classes to our nation's capital for several days. Americans, young people especially, believed in our country, with all its mistakes, stood for something unique. For the idea that all men are created equal and that government should be by consent of the governed. Johnson's speech confirmed that belief. It was a great speech. I think the most inspiring one I had ever heard, and, as it turned out, a high point of the decade. However, it was fatally marred by what happened in Vietnam.
At a single time, in a single place, to shape a turning point in man's unending search for freedom, in the long denial of equal rights of millions of Americans. To deny a man his hopes because of his color, or race, or his religion, or the place of his birth, is not only to do injustice, it is to deny America and to dishonor the dead who gave their lives for American freedom.
Almost 2 million Saigonese are jammed together in the homes, hovels, and estates of this once beautiful capital. It's the capital of a country that's been at war for almost 20 years. It's the seat of government, the focal point of intrigue, and it's the headquarters for the United States Military Command.
I decided by this time that our whole intervention in Vietnam was based off of false assumptions, at least as they were articulated by our government. In the fall of 1967, I went to Washington for a day-long conference at the State Department. Invitations had been sent to heads of secondary schools and their history departments to meet with VIPs for briefings on the Vietnam War. The government hoped to influence educators, who in turn would persuade their agitated and alienated students of the necessity of us to be in Southeast Asia. The men I felt the most sorry for were the ones who fought, who were taught to kill, and found they were killing more women and children than enemy soldiers. The nature of war has changed. Early in December of 1967, an anti-war Democrat, Senator Eugene McCarthy from Minnesota, whom most of us had never heard of, declared he was challenging President Johnson for the nomination of our party in the 1968 elections and would begin campaigning in the New Hampshire primary. We got to know most of the McCarthy supporters from all parts of the state, and we were ready. I was West Hartford's committee chairman and became one of the 9 members of the Connecticut State Convention. We hoped to influence public opinion and send a message not only to the public about the war, but to party insiders about the closed political system, the very one we were trying to use. We wanted to state forcefully that it was undemocratic and would have to be changed. Our long shot campaign we saw as a means to an end. On April 4th, 3 days before the primary, Martin Luther King Jr. was killed by a white man's bullet while he was helping Memphis garbage men gain a living wage.
50 years ago, a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand today.
I felt a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach. The first emotionally depressing blow to the campaign, but not the last. On August 26th, Bud, Kate, Dan, and 2 young friends and I stepped out of the O'Hare Airport and into occupied Chicago. Police were everywhere. Guns, barbed wire, police escorts, all presumably to protect us from the gathering mob of young people. It was hard to believe. What had our democracy come to if presidential nominations were to be conducted in armed camps? Few people mentioned the violence inside the convention hall, but it was there as well as on the streets. In March of 1971, 170 of us from 41 states, a people's delegation, flew out of New York on Icelandic Airlines for the peace talks in Paris, participating in a citizens' conference on ending the war in Indochina. All of us felt the war was tearing our society apart and must be ended. We all wanted to find out whether the negotiations in Paris held any promise of reaching a solution, and if not, what we, as United States citizens, could do to get things moving. At this point of my mulling over and summing up, I found myself asking 2 questions. Why have I devoted so much of my life to working on causes, whose outcomes are sure to be ambiguous at best, causes guaranteed frustration and disappointment? And why have I had such a good time doing it? Curiosity was my quick answer. What really is going on? Why do different people think the way they do? Getting an insight into people's motives and having a revelation of a historic trend is almost as exciting to me as hearing the first spring peepers or the loon's wild call. As Bud used to say, whenever we experience something especially baffling or incomprehensible, it's all a part of the grand pageantry of life. And life is pretty grand in all of its sordidness and glory. A phone call in the spring of 1975 from an old classmate, Ella. How would you like to be Commissioner of Public Utilities Control Authority? I said yes almost immediately, without needing persuasion, and without knowing what I was agreeing to. I wondered why Ella chose me. As the first woman governor elected of her own merits, I think she was hoping to make strides for women in her administration. The feminist movement was at its height in those days, and both of us were beneficiaries. I am so grateful to Ella for that job. Show me another one who would expand my horizons that much. Some of the most complicated issues we dealt with revolved around nuclear power. The last 6 months of my regulatory career was fittingly climactic. We did have our hands overfull. We had no hearing officer at the time, so all 5 of us held the hearings on electric and gas regulations, cogeneration, load control programs, pricing principles, and rate structures. At the end of April, Ella announced her new slate of commissioners to be sworn in on July 1st, and of course, I was not one of them. That was the end of my regulatory career. I had learned a great deal about state government works, about managing a big organization, about human character, about the importance and difficulties of various industries, energy in particular. For 1 golden month, we relaxed in Squam. But plans changed at the end of July. I had a phone call from a member of the Hartford College Board of Trustees. My year of acting president at Hartford College was a piece of cake compared to chairing the PUCA. I eventually felt at home at the job, and Bud would come to my office for tea and afternoon chat, a benefit of that year's work. He and his search committee found a very capable successor, and I no longer felt a stranger at HCW. I really did retire that summer. The presidency of Hartford College for Women was my last paying job. But I was still young, 62, and energetic, and found a whole political world waiting. The 2 most important matters I was involved with during these years was the nuclear freeze movement and the low-intensity conflicts our country was waging in Central America. Personally, these were decades of rejoice in a new generation and grieving for losses that one knows are inevitable but nonetheless heart-wrenching. And perhaps I'll have time to describe while coping with old age. As my year at Hartford College wound down, I was approached by the West Hartford Democratic Town Committee chairman, who asked me to run for the town council, and of course, I said yes. The local Freeze group I was most familiar and active with was West Hartford's, organized mainly by Martha Vinnick, who also had been inspired by the Military Spending Conference. The West Hartford Freeze group was particularly good at getting media attention. The Freeze movement closed up shop when the Berlin Wall came down and the Cold War ended.
In the thousands, they are here in the tens of thousands. Occasionally they shout, "Die Mauer muss weg, the wall must go." Thousands and thousands of West Germans come to make the point that the wall has suddenly become irrelevant.
We had won the battle, but we had lost the war to restrain military spending. Today, the U.S. spends about as much on military as the rest of the world combined. And what about nuclear weapons? Many of us in the U.S. understand the danger of nuclear proliferation on the part of other countries, but not as many of us on our own country's military might, and nuclear threat must be curbed. We've always been the good guys, haven't we? Why should anyone be afraid of us? While our countries rattled our nuclear swords at the Soviet Union, it was expanding its military presence closer to home, Central America. The Middle East of the 1980s was in turmoil, and the U.S. was blaming communism. Others were pointing to deteriorating economic conditions. Because I taught U.S. history with an emphasis on foreign policy, especially as it related to Latin America, I was particularly concerned about ominous developments in that area. In November of 1984, I joined 16 other members of SANE as the official observer to the first elections to be held in Nicaragua since the Sandinistan revolutionaries took power. Reagan, campaigning for a second term, was working hard to discredit those elections. An exciting time to visit a country is soon after it has achieved a revolution, at least a revolution that most of the population supported. The things I didn't stress enough in this report were the extreme efforts the U.S. used to try to delegitimize the Nicaraguan 1984 elections. My experiences in Central America reminded me, as a woman, to be grateful. I live in the United States in the 20th and 21st centuries. Women in the U.S., those struggled, have gained the right to own property, to vote, to share equal rights with their husband, to divorce, and to be guardians of their own children. This progress has made more life-enhancing experiences possible for me and many others. However, my natural optimism faded during the last 25 years. What I observed in the 5 trips to Central America added to my pessimism. Things ended up bringing me back to Central America, and the next time I traveled there would be 1988 with the American Service Committee. Bud and I contributed money annually to that organization, and when they announced a trip to help participants understand the root causes and current characteristics and consequences of the crisis in Central America, I signed up, eager to get back to a country whose plight continued to haunt me all through the 80s and 90s. The methods the AFC has developed after working for many decades to help change the lives of the poor involved organizing committees to find their own solutions. The journey had not diminished my enthusiasm for the AFSC, nor the future contributions. My 5th and last trip to Central America in 1998 was again planned and guided by the Center of Global Education. It was called Building a Just Society, the Honduran Challenge. On September 17, 1990, Bud died of cancer. He had lived a full and successful, even celebrated life, certainly to the students he taught at Hartford College for Women and the many school children whose classes he spoke to. Again in 1999, Martha and I went off together to a peace conference in The Hague, a reprise of the peace conference held 100 years earlier at the beginning of the new millennium that turned out to be the bloodiest in history. In 1995, I had another chance to explore the issues of peace and injustice. Early that year, I went with a friend to hear Executive Secretary of Women's International League for Peace and Freedom headquarters in Geneva, Switzerland. It's the oldest continuously active peace organization in the world. August 6th, we participated in a ceremony commemorating the nuclear destruction of Hiroshima. Little blonde children and many adults gravely set paper boats carrying lit candles afloat in the inlet of the Baltic Sea. One more adventure, at the age of 82. Was I too old for such an expedition? I thought I could manage, but would the trip's organizers agree? After his talk, I spoke to Professor Brooks about the possibility of joining the seminar. He suggested I apply. By June, when I joined the CC Summer Seminar, I had some background in the complicated country of Israel. Before we even unpacked, we were transported back to biblical times. From then on, we spent every day digging up the past, experiencing the past, living in the past, the geography and stories of the Bible. I would like to say I have an impact on my growing family. For 16 years, I have been living alone, losing a warm companion with someone close who shared ideas, adventures, and responsibilities for household maintenance, financial decisions, but also gaining my independence and privacy, which I've cherished. How do I describe the final act in my life? Aches and pains, walking less steadily, eyes failing, sometimes lonely, holding signs against the Iraq War, against Bush and his administration, for universal health care, and the reestablishment of our constitutional rights.
It is great to be here. Happy birthday, Mims. It's just a wonderful occasion, and I want to...
Happy birthday, dear Mims.
Therefore, be it proclaimed that on behalf of the Town Council and the residents of West Hartford, I, Mayor Sherry G. Cantor, do hereby recognize and celebrate Miriam Brooks Butterworth on her 100th birthday and appreciate her tireless political activism in the struggle for peace and justice in the 20th century, extend gratitude for her outstanding service to the community, and extend best wishes for continued health and happiness to her and her family. Thank you so much.
Somebody